This is the story of how the most famous entertainer in the world came within days of losing everything, and how the empire that nearly destroyed him became the foundation for one of the greatest financial reversals in American history. When Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009, he left behind more than $500 million in debt, a ranch already surrendered to creditors, and 3 children who had received nothing from his estate. The IRS was preparing a bill that would eventually reach $731 million. And yet, 16 years later, that same estate had generated an estimated $3.5 billion, making Jackson the highest-earning deceased celebrity since Forbes began tracking posthumous earnings in 2001. To understand how that happened, you have to understand how he got into trouble in the first place. And that story begins with what may have been the single smartest purchase in the history of the music industry: the Beatles catalogue. On August 10, 1985, Michael Jackson acquired ATV Music Publishing, a catalogue of roughly 4,000 songs that included the publishing rights to 251 compositions by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. The price was $47.5 million. The contract was signed on the 10th, and the announcement went public 4 days later. Paul McCartney had introduced Jackson to the concept of music publishing, explaining how the real money wasn't in recording songs, but in owning them. When the ATV catalogue came up for sale, McCartney tried to buy it himself. He and Yoko Ono were outbid, and when McCartney found out Jackson had won, he was furious. Jackson's response was blunt. If McCartney didn't want to invest $47.5 million in his own songs, he had no business complaining afterward. John Branca, Jackson's entertainment attorney, engineered the deal over 10 months at a cost of more than $1 million in legal fees, involving more than 100 lawyers and 8 separate contract drafts. One small detail belongs here. The one Beatles song not transferred in the ATV deal was Penny Lane, because seller Robert Holmes of court had previously gifted that song to his teenage daughter Catherine, as it was her favorite. Jackson walked away with 251 Lennon-McCartney compositions, just not that one. 10 years later, in November 1995, Jackson merged ATV with Sony's publishing arm to create Sony/ATV Music Publishing, with both parties holding an equal 50% stake. Sony paid Jackson $115 million as an equalizing payment, plus an additional $32.5 million over 5 years. Overnight, Jackson was co-owner of one of the most valuable music publishing companies on earth, generating royalties every time those thousands of songs were played, licensed, or performed anywhere in the world. What nobody anticipated was how thoroughly he would manage to turn that advantage into a liability. How the debt built. The pattern of Jackson's finances from the late 1990s onward was consistent and alarming. Enormous assets, enormous liabilities, and a rate of spending that no catalog ownership could sustain indefinitely. By the end of 1998, just 3 years after forming Sony/ATV, Jackson had borrowed $140 million from Bank of America, with his stake in the joint venture pledged as collateral. By 2005, that loan had grown to roughly $270 million, which was enough for the bank to sell the entire portfolio to a New York private equity firm called Fortress Investment Group, a company specializing in distressed debt. That shift mattered enormously. Bank of America had been a patient, long-term lender. Fortress was not, and their arrival as Jackson's primary creditor changed everything about what he owed and to whom. By December 2005, the loans came due. A restructuring followed with Sony's assistance and Citigroup helping structure the terms, but the cost was steep as Jackson reportedly granted Sony an option to acquire a portion of his stake in the joint venture. A personal financial statement dated June 12, 2007, prepared by the accounting firm Thompson, Cobb, Basilio and Associates, listed assets of $567.5 million alongside debts of $331 million, producing a stated net worth of $236.5 million. On paper, he was solvent, but those assets were largely illiquid, and the annual cost of servicing what he owed was running approximately $30 million a year, according to forensic accountant testimony at the 2013 AEG live wrongful death trial. $30 million a year going out before Jackson spent a single dollar on anything else, borrowed against an asset he couldn't easily sell, with no cushion for any disruption. Neverland Ranch was the most visible symbol of that problem, and it was the first thing to crack. Neverland, default and rescue. Jackson purchased the property in March of 1988 from developer William Bone, paying approximately $19.5 million for what was then called Sycamore Valley Ranch. Located in Los Olivos, Santa Barbara County, on the edge of Los Padres National Forest, the roughly 2,700-acre estate centered on a 12,598 square foot Normandy-style mansion with 6 bedrooms. What Jackson spent transforming it into tens of millions more: a private amusement park with a 65-foot Ferris wheel, a zoo housing chimpanzees, giraffes, and elephants, 3 private railroad lines, and a 50-seat movie theater. After his acquittal on all 10 charges at a 2005 criminal trial, Jackson walked off the property and never returned. Neverland sat empty, costing an estimated $5 million a year to maintain, generating no income, and serving as collateral on loans growing harder to service by the month. Fortress Investment Group held the note, and on February 25, 2008, a formal notice arrived. $24,525,906 was due by March 19th, or the property would go to public auction. Jackson owned an estate once valued above $100 million, held a 50% stake in one of the world's most valuable music publishing companies, and could not produce $24.5 million. The rescue came on May 12, 2008, when Thomas Barrick, founder of Colony Capital, purchased the defaulted Fortress loan for approximately $22.5 million, cancelling the foreclosure auction. By November 10, 2008, the title had transferred to Sycamore Valley Ranch Company, LLC, a joint venture in which Jackson retained an 87.5% undivided interest but lost managing control entirely. Colony was entitled to its loan principal back, reimbursement for all upkeep expenses, and a 12.5% success fee with a minimum floor of $3.33 million. Jackson had been pulled back from the edge, but he was no longer in charge of his most famous property. 7 months later, he was dead. The property eventually sold in December 2020, when billionaire Ron Burkle purchased it for $22 million, after it had listed at $100 million, dropped to $67 million, and fallen further to around $31 million by 2019. The final sale price was essentially what Colony Capital had paid for the distressed loan 12 years earlier. Death and the estate. The death came at his Holmby Hills rental home on June 25, 2009, a property he had been renting for $100,000 a month since December 2008. The coroner ruled it a homicide caused by acute propofol intoxication, and personal physician Dr. Conrad Murray was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter. More than 65 creditors filed claims. More than half a dozen lawsuits were pending worldwide. The most significant assets were encumbered by more than $500 million in debt, some already in default, and his 3 children had received nothing. Jackson's 2002 will named 2 co-executors, John Branca and John McClain, a music executive and childhood friend of the Jackson family who had helped launch Janet Jackson's solo career. Branca had been fired in 2003 but rehired on June 17, 2009, just 8 days before Jackson's death, a decision that turned out to matter enormously. The estate also retained Howard Weitzman as lead litigation attorney, who had previously represented clients including John DeLorean and Marlon Brando, and who remained the estate's primary litigator until his death in April 2021. Their strategy was to bring all debt current, negotiate lower interest rates, generate cash from new projects, and work through the obligations that had overwhelmed Jackson while he was alive. The first major revenue arrived within months. In October 2009, the documentary This Is It, assembled from rehearsal footage of the cancelled comeback tour, grossed $267.9 million worldwide. Guinness World Records recognized it as the highest-grossing documentary film at the global box office, and the estate earned an estimated $200 million from that release alone. The turnaround had started. The IRS, a $731 million bill. Estate taxes are calculated on fair market value at the time of death, and for Jackson's estate, determining those values became one of the most contested tax disputes in American history. Three assets sat at the center: his name and likeness rights, his Sony/ATV interest held through New Horizon Trust 2, and his MyJack music catalog held through New Horizon Trust 3. The estate valued Jackson's name and likeness at $2,105. The IRS valued it at $161 million. The estate valued his Sony/ATV interest at $0. The IRS valued it at $206 million. The estate valued MyJack at $2,300,000. The IRS valued it at $114 million. In May 2013, the IRS issued its formal notice of deficiency. $505 million in taxes plus $196 million in accuracy-related penalties, totaling approximately $702 million, later raised to $731 million. The estate filed its tax court petition on July 26, 2013. The case went to Judge Mark Firth Holmes, and the trial ran from February 2017 to August 2019. The IRS had one expert witness: Weston Anson, chairman of an intellectual property valuation firm. Under cross-examination, his testimony collapsed. Anson denied ever having worked for the IRS before. Documentation proved he had on the Whitney Houston estate case roughly 2 years earlier. He denied his firm had advertised its involvement in the Jackson case. He was shown the advertising. Judge Holmes found that Anson had perjured himself 3 times, effectively destroying the foundation of the IRS's valuation argument. The estate's position on name and likeness rested on an uncomfortable reality. In his final years, Jackson had earned essentially nothing from licensing his image outside of music. The molestation accusations, despite the acquittal, had made him toxic to corporate sponsors, and no active merchandising deals existed at the time of his death. The estate's appraiser, Owen Dahl, testified that Jackson was, in his words, a deeply flawed person with serious, significant issues when it came to licensing image and likeness in a non-music setting. On the Sony/ATV interest, the estate argued the trust structure made it effectively worthless because it could not be sold, borrowed against, or converted into cash under the trust's governing terms. On May 3, 2021, Judge Holmes released his ruling, all 271 pages. On name and likeness, $4,153,912, close to the estate's position and far from the IRS's $161 million. On Sony/ATV, $0, exactly as the estate argued. On MyJack, $107,313,561, the one area where the IRS came reasonably close. Total disputed assets under IRS figures, roughly $482 million. Total as Holmes determined them, roughly $111 million. And then all the accuracy-related penalties, nearly $200 million, were thrown out entirely because the IRS failed to produce written evidence that the supervisor who approved the penalties had signed off as required by law. Holmes wrote that the estate's assets had been managed with stunningly greater competence than they had been in Jackson's own hands, and that it was to the considerable benefit of the estate that Jackson was no longer able to get in the way of the rational profit maximizers who were now in control. How the debt got paid. The Sony/ATV resolution came through a mechanism built into the original 1995 joint venture agreement. Either party could trigger a buy-sell process at fair market value. In September 2015, Sony exercised that right. The estate chose to sell. The deal closed on September 30th, 2016, with Sony paying $750 million for the estate's 50% stake. The ATV catalogue had cost Jackson $47.5 million in 1985. 31 years later, his half of what that catalogue built sold for $750 million. The estate earned a record $825 million in 2016, the highest single-year figure Forbes had ever recorded for any celebrity, living or dead. In 2018, Sony's acquisition of ATV Music Publishing included the estate's 25% stake, purchased for $287.5 million, bringing cumulative posthumous earnings past $2.4 billion. Then, in 2024, Sony Music acquired a 50% stake in Jackson's remaining publishing and master recording assets, paying approximately $600 million at a total valuation of between $1.2 and $1.5 billion. Probate Judge Mitchell Beckloff approved the deal in April 2023 over Katherine Jackson's objections, and the California Court of Appeal affirmed that decision on August 21, 2024. Additional revenue arrived from the Cirque du Soleil Immortal World Tour, which ran from 2011 through 2014 and ranked among the top-grossing tours of all time at $360 million per Billboard box score. The permanent Cirque show, Michael Jackson 1, opened at Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas in June 2013 and has been extended through 2030. MJ the Musical opened on Broadway on February 1, 2022, recouped its $22 million investment in just over a year and had grossed over $319 million by early 2026. And in April 2026, the biographical film Michael, directed by Antoine Fuqua and starring Jackson's nephew Jafar Jackson, opened to a global debut weekend of $218.8 million. A 2024 court filing stated that the executors had paid in full all of the debt that had overwhelmed Jackson during his lifetime. Cumulative posthumous earnings now sit at an estimated $3.5 billion. Here is what the numbers tell us. Michael Jackson died carrying more than $500 million in debt, his most famous property already surrendered to a private equity firm, his children receiving nothing, and the IRS preparing a bill that would reach $731 million. His name and image carried a stated value on his own estate tax return of $2,105. 16 years later, that same estate has generated $3.5 billion. The Sony/ATV catalogue he bought for $47.5 million helped anchor transactions totaling well over $1 billion. The tax court rejected the overwhelming majority of the IRS claim. All the debt has been paid. Jackson has topped Forbes' list of highest-earning deceased celebrities in 13 of the 16 full calendar years since his death, earning an estimated $105 million in 2025 alone. The irony Judge Holmes captured in his ruling is the one that stays with you. Those same assets Jackson had nearly lost became worth far more precisely because he was no longer there to manage them. John Branca negotiated the ATV deal in 1985, stood at the closing table when Sony paid $750 million for the other half of what that deal created, was named co-executor in Jackson's 2002 will, and was rehired 8 days before Jackson died. The music outlasted the debt. It always does. If this story held your attention, hit the like button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells the algorithm this content deserves a wider audience. If you want more documentary-style deep dives into the financial stories behind the biggest names in music history, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover the deals, the debts, the legal battles, and the recoveries that rarely get told in full, because those stories are often more compelling than the music itself. Drop your questions in the comments below. We read every one, and the best questions have a way of turning into future videos. Michael Jackson's estate is still in probate. The IRS dispute has not fully closed. There is more of this story left to tell, and we plan to tell it.